I was a loyal Canon fanboy for the last 15 years or so, but here are the 5 reasons why I switched to Sony. Now for some context and disclosure, Sony has no idea I'm making this video. Most of this stuff here I bought with my own money. The only thing on this table that I did not purchase with my own money that Sony gave me was this microphone, which came in a little gift bag thing that everyone that attended the Sony condo trip ended up getting. But everything else outside of this 50mm G Master lens has been purchased by me, so at least know that for context. Now, one of the first and largest reasons I switched from Canon is their lack of availability and openness about their RF mount. If you're unaware, as many of my followers on Instagram were actually, the RF is a closed mount, meaning that any lens that is made by a third-party manufacturer isn't able to use any of Canon's autofocus algorithms and all that kind of stuff. So companies like Viltrox, which I did a video about their 85mm 1.8. Soon after that video came out, Canon actually sent them like a cease and desist or whatever, and they pulled that lens from the market. And yes, there are decades and decades worth of EF lenses that are available for the RF system, and they do perform amazingly well, but you're definitely just limited in your choices outside of the EF lenses, and adding that adapter with older glass that isn't necessarily optimized for higher resolution sensors and doesn't benefit from all the in-body corrections that many of the cameras get now just makes that a lot more limiting. Especially because if you follow to this channel, you've seen the video that I did on the Sigma 28-70 2.8. This was actually one of the first lenses that I purchased for the Sony E-mounts, and all of the Sigma glass, all of the Tamron glass, stuff from Viltrox is able to be made on the Sony setup. The other thing with lenses is that Sony just frankly is a much more mature system. Now, I have no doubt that Canon will come out with their full range of RF lenses at some point, but as it currently sits, they don't have a professional 24, they don't have a professional 35. And on the Sony E-mount, I believe they have almost 50 lenses that are full frame, plus all of the other third-party manufacturers. There are just hundreds and hundreds of options to choose from, and if you are on the Canon system, you are just stuck with using either adapted lenses or the current stuff that they make for the RF mount, which again is pretty limited in comparison to the Sony stuff. All of the G and GM lenses from Sony that I've tried are amazing, specifically this 20mm f1.8 G lens, the 24mm f1.4 GM, the 35 1.4 GM that I recently purchased. The 50 1.2 GM is an incredible lens, and I recently purchased this 135 GM. All of that newer Sony glass, I'm not noticing a bunch of chromatic aberration and other things that I need to fix in post, and they are really, really sharp, but they also have a really cool and unique look to them that doesn't feel overly sterile, but actually still has some character, which is something I definitely appreciate. The second reason that I switched from Canon to Sony, frankly, was actually just this FX3. Personally, I, like many others, have always found Sony cameras to be a bit more computerish, a bit more robotic. Using especially the earlier A7 models always just felt more like I was booting something up on like DOS or something in comparison to using like a Mac OS system. I also own a lot of Fujifilm cameras and Leica cameras and Hasselblad, and I love old film cameras, and that aesthetic and that use and that inspiration is something that I definitely look for in my gear. And the FX3 is one of those cameras that legitimately feels special. And maybe I'll make another video on this at some point, but there's just something to be said about a camera that you see on your shelf and you want to pick up and use. The ergonomics are amazing. I think the look is great, but just for my workflow, everything about it just works super well, from the XLR top handle, so I just run everything straight into the camera. This camera setup was the first camera that I purchased from Sony and was definitely my gateway camera of sorts. And speaking of which, the third reason that I switched from Canon to Sony specifically was the compatibility of the other cameras along with their FX3 cinema camera. While I owned the R6 and liked the stuff coming out of it, The C-Log 3 profile just wasn't up to snuff in comparison to the F-Log 3 that I'm getting out of the Sony stuff. And yes, the C70 has C-Log 2, which is amazing, but I wanted to have cameras where this A7 IV has the same S-Log 3 profile that the FX3 does. I found that specifically in the dynamic range, the S-Log 3 profile just did so much better than the C-Log 3 profile, and for me, that's something that feels a lot more professional and usable and everything. So while, yes, I love having a dedicated video camera, for something that's a little bit more hybrid, I found the A7 IV to just be a lot more usable as a hybrid camera for me, and so it definitely helped me go in this direction. The fourth reason for me switching from Canon to Sony is something that a lot of other people might not have a use for necessarily, but adapting Leica M lenses onto a Sony versus onto a Canon is kind of a night and day difference. In both the dynamic range, which we talked about earlier in the S-Log 3 profile, but also in the color fringing on anything wider than a 50mm. On the Sony, it definitely looked great and definitely rivaled even the Leica SL, but on the Canon, you got a ton of weird color fringing around the outsides. And for me, especially getting into this system and leaning more into it while I also use my Leica stuff, but the availability to just adapt lenses that I already had onto the system in a much, much better way than the Canon stuff gave me a lot more flexibility and was another reason why it made this switch a little bit easier. And the fifth reason that I switched over from Canon to Sony for all of my kind of hybrid photo video stuff is simply that I just love the company ethos, I guess, and the speed of innovation and stuff that they just keep coming out with constantly. Now, I will say that I have a bit of a relationship with Sony. They sponsored one of my videos last year, and one of the things that I'll give them respect for is that yes, they gave me some loaner cameras to try out and whatnot, but it wasn't until I actually purchased the cameras for myself and started really diving into this system that they started inviting me to the condo trip, and then they flew me out for the press event for the A7R5, which I'm filming this on right now. So I'd be lying if I said that having some sort of a relationship with a company, even if it's just that I get to use their products and try things out, is something that's going to be a factor. And frankly, I've reached out to Canon so many times over the years, and even when I get in touch with somebody, they just give me the regular customer service email that everybody else uses, which is fine. They don't have to do anything with me. They don't have to let me try out new things. They don't have to let me review their gear. Totally fine. But again, if I was saying that that wasn't some sort of a subliminal factor in all of this, I would probably be misguiding you. But again, I purchased both the FX3 and the A7 IV before Sony really kind of started talking to me more about doing things with them. So it is what it is there. And I guess I'll end with saying that this is definitely not a, hey, you should switch to Sony video. If you are happy with your setup from Canon or Nikon or Fujifilm or whatever the case may be, don't switch. Personally, I had a few reasons that we've obviously documented here that made sense for me to switch, but that might not be the case for everyone. And so I don't want you all thinking like, oh my goodness, now I have to spend thousands of dollars to switch systems just because this random guy on the internet says I need to. But I figured I'd at least kind of air my grievances in a way and give you some sort of rationale around why I did and why maybe some of those points might be helpful for you as well. And if you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments below. I did answer some of these over on my Instagram reels, so if you want to follow me over there, you can definitely check those out. And we'll jump into a few of those right here for some added perspective. A lot of you asking if I am switching away from Leica, and the answer is no. I use both for different things. The Leicas are kind of more like an instrument almost. They feel connected to the process, inspiring, you know, all those kind of things. And then the Sony is just a great camera for everything that I need to do. It just has all like the best tech, the best autofocus, pairing something that is incredibly technical, but still beautiful and has all of the different things that I could ever want with something that is very limited in its scope of, I guess, technology, but is a very fun process, is kind of a good way to go about doing both of those things for me. And I do think that the experience of being photographed by something like this actually does have some significance versus being photographed with something like this. So no, I'm not leaving Leica at all, just augmenting it and adding to it with the Sony stuff. I actually did a full video earlier this year comparing the original Canon R6 to the Sony a7 IV. They obviously have a lot of similarities, and especially that bump up to the R6 Mark II. Definitely a great camera, and I can't say that one is like significantly better than another. And even in my original video, I didn't say that you should just switch systems completely for one or the other. You're gonna switch systems for the system, not necessarily that camera. And again, I'm not trying to get anybody to switch systems at all. If you're happy with the system that you're in, definitely stay with it. But I guess partially what I'm trying to do is get rid of some misconceptions that I personally had about the Sony system, which definitely dissuaded me away from actually considering them for my own work. I have gotten a lot of questions about just the color science of Sony and if I need to update my presets for it, anything like that. No, I haven't needed to. Canon leans a little bit more magenta. Nikon leans a little bit more into like the yellowish greens. Sony kind of leans into not necessarily green, but less magenta than the Canon stuff is. The newest Sony bodies like the a7 IV, A1, a7S III, the a7R5, that kind of newest generation have definitely updated their color science to work a lot better, but just with simple white balance and the HSL panel in Lightroom, I'm pretty much able to match anything that I want. You don't really have to update any of your presets unless you want to just save some of those settings into there. I had a lot of questions about the Leica SL2 and the SL2S system. Those are amazing cameras and cameras that are in this larger form factor that did feel really cool and inspiring to me, but they have one major downside for me, and that was the reason I didn't go with them. The autofocus is just like not quite there yet. Despite, again, me really liking those bodies and those lenses, when I want to use an autofocus camera, I want that autofocus to just be spot on. I know I can rely on it. And unfortunately, in some situations that I used at actual weddings, those cameras had failed me, getting people walking down the aisle, things like that, where I know I can even nail that manually focusing, and absolutely could nail that on the Canon EOS R system as well as the Sony's. So paying significantly more money for less performance in the space that I really needed it in just wasn't a spot where I was going to spend my money. That's a good question. So a recent video I did on the a7 IV partially was because I realized as I went through my Lightroom catalog that I delivered more photos to clients with the a7 IV than I did with either of my Leicas this last year. Part of that is just because of the times of day that I'm using the Sony versus the Leica. I've moved over to using the Sony for all of my dance floor coverage, so all the party dancing stuff. I also use it for all the family groupings because I have started to use this 28-70 from Sigma. That way it's just easier than switching lenses. And then anything beyond 50 millimeters, so I have a 28 and a 50 is my kind of main combo for the Leica stuff. Anything beyond that up to, you know, like 85, 90, 135 even, all that kind of stuff has been on the Sony for the most part this year. So while I do love, obviously, the process of using the Leicas, there are just times where having all of the different technology stuff has been really helpful for me. I think that every photographer who is serious about their craft should have at least one camera that is a get the job done kind of camera, and one kind of camera that is just super fun to use. Whether it's a camera like this Hasselblad film camera, the GFX, the X100V, a Leica, whatever the case may be, having something as an artist that you want to use and is inspiring to you as a tool is incredibly beneficial, but then also having something that you view as a tool and you use because you want to get the job done and you don't necessarily need to feel inspired by it, also a great thing to have. So the new buttons and the settings and things on the Sony was definitely something that intimidated me. I'll also add that no matter what camera you are moving from and to, I guess, if you're changing cameras, the buttons are always going to be in a different space. I have multiple Fujifilm cameras, I have used multiple Canon cameras, and every time I buy a new one, the buttons are still just a little bit in different places. So my advice always is to just use the camera a ton when you first get it, nail down that muscle memory, and then you'll be good to go. Once I used it for a little bit, it started to make a lot more sense, and frankly has been something that has been helpful. I use this for shutter speed, this for ISO, this for aperture if I need that. C1 is white balance. Here's my autofocus button. Here is my zoom button to check focus if needed. There's just a lot of stuff on here that, yes, can be intimidating, but once you just jump in the menus, figure out the stuff you actually want to program in, and then just ignore the stuff you don't, it works really well. The first nice camera that I ever had was the Canon XTI. I moved from that to the 20D, to the 30D, until I got to the Canon 5D. This is like the greatest of all time camera and made my work really stand out in a way that those other cameras hadn't. I moved from this to the 5D2 to the 5D3, and that's when I started kind of just getting a little bit bummed about the whole Canon system, moved over to more Fujifilm and Leica stuff, and with the EOS R, I was pretty excited about that whole thing. I bought that camera, and then I bought the R6, and they were good cameras for sure, and I'm not trying to convince anybody not to use Canon stuff. I frankly just had a bad perception of Sony being something that was just like a computer and very just uninspiring. But as things have progressed, and especially as they've come out with new lenses and new technology, updated their menus, updated their color science in the last couple of years, it made this whole thing a much easier move. So lenses and lens selection is actually one of the top reasons that made me switch. Like this lens, the 28-70 Sigma, is a fantastic ultra compact zoom lens that has an amazing range. This is just not available on Canon. The RF mount is a closed mount where they are not allowing lenses onto their system other than their native stuff. So if you want something outside of the RF lenses, you have to adapt them with the EF adapter. And to me, that is a huge detriment because yes, Sony makes a ton of lenses that are amazing, and actually most of them are relatively affordable, but there are just those other lenses like the Sigma that I don't think Sony's gonna make a version of this. I don't think Canon's gonna make a version of this. And the fact that it's just not going to be available as it currently stands is a huge detriment. The other thing that also is sort of unrelated to photography, but the FX3, it's the camera that I'm using right now. I'm plugging this mic directly into the top handle. It's just a very inspiring camera for me, at least, as a dedicated video tool. And having something in the Sony system that was inspiring to me allowed me to get into that and see all the other options that I guess, you know, don't necessarily need to be inspiring and just need to do a really good job. So thanks so much for watching. Let me know again if you have any more questions in the comments down below. Subscribe if you haven't already. I definitely have a ton more Sony and Leica and Fujifilm content coming out in the near future. We also recently hit 50,000 subscribers on here, which is a huge goal of mine. So I want to thank everyone that has subscribed. And if you have not, I definitely have larger goals for this channel. So, you know, hitting that subscribe button does actually do a lot for me. But thanks again, and I will see you all on the next one.